Good morning, everyone. A very, very big welcome to this webinar. I'm Joan Hughes, the President of Council on the Ageing, New South Wales. Welcome to today's webinar, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We'll learn a lot about how it happened, what it means, and how to move forward. This is a very, very important discussion, and we're so pleased many of you could join us today. So our two guest speakers have just appeared on screen. So a very big welcome to Thomas and a very big welcome to Susan. When I went to primary school, that was in the 50s, we learnt nothing about First Nations people, nothing at all. And it was only until I started to work with First Nations colleagues in the different jobs that I've had through 30 years of working in the non-for-profit sector that I really started to understand more about their issues and about their needs, and especially in relation to stolen generation people and the impact that has had on them, on their families, on their communities, and across generations in their families. The other thing that also makes me very, very sad is that the life expectancy of First Nations elders is around 20 years less than non-Indigenous people. So on the average, our First Nations elders die at the age of 60. And for men and women, it varies according to where they live, but the more remote areas of Australia, the numbers are, the years are around 66 for men and around 69 for women. So this webinar is for all of us to learn more about First Nations people, what they've been through, what their goals are for the future. So let's get started. I'd like to call on both Susan and Thomas to do an acknowledgement of country. Susan?
Thank you, Joan. I'd like to start by saying Warrami, Nagaya Susan, Nagaya Gurindji Woolwonga. Gumida Biyanga, Gumida Waranga, Madamarong, Tianaga Anaga, Madamarong, Bialia. Gamarigal Guri Pemel. What I said was, hello, my name's Susan. I'm Gurindji Woolwonga. With honour and respect, I ask to speak to the male spirits and the female spirits to be able to walk and talk on the land of the Gamarigal people. So I'm here on Sydney's Northern Beaches. I spoke one of the Sydney languages, which was gifted to me by Professor Dennis Foley, who is a Camaragal descendant and elder and knowledge holder. I would like to acknowledge all the nations that you are currently on, and I look forward to participating in this discussion about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'd now like to hand over to Thomas to do an acknowledgement from where he is in the country.
Thank you, Susan. Kapu Goiga, everybody. Good day. Torres Strait Islander coming to you from Larrakia country in Darwin. So I pay my respects to the Larrakia people and their elders past and present, and pay respects to traditional owners and elders past and present from where you're coming from too. On mute, Joan.
You're on mute, Joan.
Oh, God. That's a good start. Just for those people who may not know much about COTA, just very quickly, COTA stands for Council on the Ageing, and we are obviously the peak organisation for people over 50 in New South Wales. So our main job is to put governments on notice. So we do a lot of policy and advocacy work, and we also run a range of services. If you want more information about Council on the Ageing New South Wales, just have a quick look on our website. But all of the work that we do, we want to make sure that the views of older people are heard and acted on. So yeah, that's a big job these days as governments believe in certain things, of course, that we don't believe in. It's always tricky. Anyway, just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. Everyone except Thomas, Susan, and myself, all of you are on mute, and you can't unmute yourself. Don't follow my lead on this, but you can't unmute yourself as this is a webinar. It's not a meeting. You can ask your own questions, as Megan has told you, at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel. You can also upvote someone else's questions if you're asking something that you would like to know. We'll be answering the questions during the panel discussion, and I ask you that you make your questions to the point and also very respectful, please. We have added some polls into the presentation to give everyone a chance to participate. All polls are anonymous. No one can see what you've answered, but please participate. It does make this whole sort of platform a bit more interactive. And finally, there is a chat panel. So if you want to make a comment during the presentation, you can do that. So look, I'm very excited to be able to introduce both Thomas and Susan, but we'll start with Thomas. And so Thomas, first question to you, mate, is where are you from and what do you do?
Yeah, thank you, Joan. So I am born and bred here on Larrakia land in Darwin. As I said earlier, I'm a Torres Strait Islander. My dad came to the Northern Territory when he was 17 in about 1969 to work. A whole lot of Torres Strait Islanders did that in those times. They were the first to sort of, break the shackles, I suppose, of the protector and be able to move and start to build a life without that control. I was a wharfie from when I was 17, so worked on the docks here for 16 years, was elected as a union official, so the leader of the Northern Territory branch of the Maritime Union of Australia. Now I work in the National Office of the Maritime Union of Australia as a National Indigenous officer. And I'm an activist as well. Fighting for change for our mob, not just for workers' rights, and was lucky enough to go to be elected to go to the convention in the heart of the country that led to the making of the Uluru Statement. But I'll talk about that a bit later. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, but Thomas, you also are an author, I understand.
Yeah.
Yes. So tell us a bit about
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've written several books. I see Romaine there. I see some really good activists on this that are joining us today, actually. That's great to see. Yes, on the road with the Uluru Statement, I decided it would be a powerful thing to write a book about the people that I'd met, and that set me off on the path of being a writer. And really enjoy it. I've got a couple more books coming out in August and September, one about the Wayville Walk-Off and one about fatherhood from an Indigenous perspective. I'm really excited about that one.
Well, we look forward to that. And one of Thomas's books is called Finding the Heart of the Nation, The Journey of the Uluru Statement Towards Voice, Treaty and Truth. And we'll be talking about some of those key principles. So over to you, Thomas, for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I've already given my background. I think there's a little bit that I'll go into just about what I learnt as in the union movement. I learned the value of unity, not just the word that we say, on the street at a rally or even in a webinar like this, the importance of unity, but the structure behind unity, even this organisation, benefits from, the collective nature of representation for the aged in New South Wales, and how unity is just a word unless you have that ability to regularly reach consensus, to have accountability of representatives, and then to be able to reach agreement on what the organisation prioritises and goes after. So I got a great grasp of the importance of unity working in the union movement. And as an activist on the streets, organising responses to the really harmful decisions against our people over the years, take the community closures issue in 2015, for example, or the disgraceful treatment of youth in detention here in Darwin and Dondale that led to the Royal Commission. These decisions like the intervention, I started to realise that our advocacy as First Nations people was struggling to make progress and was at times, it felt like one step forward, two step back, and I started to realise the difference between the advocacy that I was used to in an effective union, the Maritime Union, to how we did things. One of the things I noticed was that we were incoherent in the way that we went after our issues or tried to hold politicians to account or came up with solutions. An example is, you know, for 4 speakers at a rally, you could have 10 different solutions to one problem that you're telling the crowd and the decision makers. And I learned that this was actually by design. You know, this was something that was tactically done to our people over many years. Anytime we've built a voice, a representative body from the AAPA in the 20s, led by an Aboriginal wharfie, actually, Fred Maynard, the AAL for CATSI, all the way through to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC. Every time we have established a representative voice that has challenged the status quo and challenged the decision makers in a strong way, those voices have been silenced. Those representative bodies have been destroyed. And this is a tactic of divide and conquer, really. You know, that we were able to build by our own means or by convincing government to legislate a voice, like with ATSIC, which came about from the Burunga Statement, really, that called for the establishment of something like ATSIC. That to destroy that structure and that democracy of those organisations and the coherency of them was to dilute our voice, to divide and conquer. So when I came to this realisation, it was good timing because I was invited to a constitutional dialogue in Darwin, which is one of 13 dialogues around the country. I learnt, which was led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander experts and activists. Professor Megan Davis, an expert on public law, was a lead designer of the dialogue process. And I learnt about this great opportunity that all of these dialogues would elect delegates to go to one final constitutional convention in the heart of the country to bring it all together. I was elected as a delegate from Darwin, a representative to go to that meeting, and I went there with great hope that we would reach this consensus, because that's the other thing I understand about unity, and there's power in reaching a consensus. That we could genuinely go out and say to the country, to the political leaders, but also the Australian people, this is what we want as the next step. And so after 3 days of, passionate debate and discussion, following on from 13 3-day regional dialogues around the country, which had just as much tension because it's normal that we have different ideas and political ideologies, we reached the consensus that is the Uluru Statement from the heart. And it's, I don't know if I'm talking too much here, Joan. Would you like me to recite the Uluru Statement now one time? Yeah, is that all right, Susan? Sorry. So I hope I'll recite the Uluru Statement. I've learned it off by heart. I've been campaigning this for a while. But I hope you feel what we felt when we endorsed it. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual nation, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a peoples possess the land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from our families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is a torment of our powerlessness. We see constitutional change to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. That's it. That's the Uluru Statement. So, yeah, it calls for three things: voice, treaty, truth. Voice through a constitutionally enshrined voice so that it is protected from hostile governments, so that they cannot silence it like all the other representative bodies we've built, and a Makarrata Commission to supervise the very important process of truth-telling and agreement making or treaties.
Well, I can't even express how amazing that was, Thomas. Thank you. My goodness, that was. I know you've probably said it many times, but it does come from this place, and that's the most important. I'd like to now introduce, we're going to come back to Thomas, and after Susan's given her presentation, there will be lots of questions that I've already talked about with both Thomas and Susan. And as I said, you can put your questions in the different versions at the bottom of the screen. So we're very lucky to have Susan Moylan-Coombs on the board of Council on the Age in New South Wales, and Susan has been with us now for 12 months as a board director. So Susan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do to keep yourself busy every day, which you seem to be busy every day.
Thank you, Joan, and really honoured to be on this panel and to listen to the words of Thomas and the way in which he, recites the Uluru Statement and the power and spirit that comes from that when you say those words. And I do thank you, Thomas, for the work that you've been doing, in particular, going around the country and talking to people to get a level of understanding about what it means and how we can, as you say, move forward as a group of people who cohabitate this continent that we today call Australia. And I think that that there are deep spiritual messages that are in that statement that I know it took a lot of clever minds to come together to do that. And I am aware that there were people that, as you say, there's always conflict. There's always challenging situations, I guess, is probably a better way of saying it, because we are different races of nations, so we are very multicultural in our traditional nations, and we will always come at different subject matter and I guess in this case it's about our rights as First Nations people on this continent, and people will come with different ideas, and I think that if we can harness all of that energy, because essentially we all want the same thing, and if we can respect each other and hear the voices of everybody, then I think that particularly for us as First Nations people coming from behind the eight ball, and trying to do the catch-up piece after, a checkered history in terms of our our shared living on this continent, that, you know, there is work to be done. And I want to honour you in terms of the work that you've been doing on the Uluru Statement. So personally, from my heart, thank you for doing that, because we do need people to continue to talk about this thing. And even if there is differing opinions and people who might see things from a different perspective, that's okay. And I think that, you know, being able to still hold the door open, keep a seat around the campfire so people can continue to turn up and talk from their perspective is what's important. And I guess, you know, thank you, Joan, for allowing me to sit as a board member for COTA New South Wales. And you know, my desire, I'm now over 50, so apparently I'm part of the cohort. So so it's you know, it is a joy to be able to come with a specific lens in which I see the way in which First Nations older people need a level of advocacy and protection of rights. And, you know, we're talking about the Uluru Statement, and that would be inclusive of all people as First Nations people on this land, what those rights are advocating for. And, you know, in terms of the life expectancies, in terms of work about closing the gap, and, you know, all of these different programs. And as Thomas was rightly saying, that there have been many attempts in the past to put things right. And there has been a greater design in place that has been about divide and conquer. And, you know, whether we're looking at, you know, what has happened in history and different entities that have been set up, like ATSIC, that, you know, it's, and the whole reconciliation process, you know, in amongst that, and now the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it's really about people just seeing that there is a truth. There is a truth of the history in this country that, you know, we need to acknowledge. We as First Nations people need to be able to assert ourselves as sovereign people, and not have that so challenged by the Western construct of society, that it is the truth. And why can't that acceptance of the truth of history just be? And, you know, I tend to get a little bit naughty sometimes and go, well, we can't send you all home back to the lands that you came from. So we need to learn to live together better on this continent. And I just really, you know, hope that for the sake of future generations, that as adults, as older people, and young people such as Thomas, who are doing this work, can really start to cut through, so our voices are heard and that truth is told, and that we can live on this land differently. So whilst I'm a board member of COTA, I'm also a director of my company, the Gamaragal Group, which really is about how do we hear the voice of First Nations people, elders and youth, and that exchange of knowledge to empower people, so our identity is held in a certain way for ourselves, but also for our different nations and races of people on this continent. And being able to share what that we want to share with non-Indigenous people, so we can get that critical mass to create that tipping point that you know, changes the course of what we're doing. Because we can't wait for government. That, you know, there are things that government have done, and there's, you know, there's positives and negatives in that. I think that the more that people are understanding the truth, then the questioning about how this happened and how we got to this point, and then 2017 with the Uluru Statement, why have successive prime ministers since the delivery of that statement have declined that very generous, heartfelt proposal to take us forward as a nation? So it is conversations like this when people get informed. It's conversations that Thomas has when he has travelled the country to really talk about the sentiment of the Uluru Statement. It is also knowing that not everybody signed up to the Uluru Statement, not everybody was there, not everyone got to participate. And there were workshops, there was challenges in those workshops, and some of the voices aren't heard. And I guess, the process was such a big, ambitious process that can you truly do it and hear everybody's voice in it? So, I hear those other voices sometimes, and I take them on board. I guess, this is kind of in the conversation with Thomas, which I'd like to have as well, that we're talking about changes to the Constitution, and in terms of who we are as sovereign nation people. We are Australian citizens, and we have pieces of paper that say that, we're an Australian citizen, and we're doing a dance with the Australian government and the establishment about the recognition of who we are as sovereign people. So as a Gurindji Woolwonga woman, how does Susan Gurindji Woolwonga play in this dance, participate in this dance, when I show up as Susan Moylan-Coombs, which is in the Australian realm? That's how I'm identified and perceived by the structure and the system. So we as First Nations people are wanting to shift and amend that system that puts us firmly as the sovereign people with the rights that we have, which are identified in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And I think that the 46 articles that are in that document are solid. And sadly, they cannot overrule domestic law. So great set of principles, but there's no punch or power behind them. And when we start to talk about the Uluru Statement and what it is that we truly want as First Nations people, we're still doing the dance within the system. When it's almost like we've got to go and recognise that we were, as you say, the sovereign powers. Australia as a nation is now seen as a sovereign nation. So what does that mean for us as sovereign peoples? And I've been looking forward to a conversation like this with you, Thomas, because I think that so many people are signing up to the Uluru Statement, and there is good intent behind why people are doing it. There is a level of kind of, I still feel a little bit unsettled about how we're doing that dance. And I guess, I would really love to hear your thoughts on that, Thomas.
Yes, would you like me to respond, Joan?
Yes, I would. And but before you do, Thomas, just one thing, Susan, can you tell us after Thomas discusses that point, just a little bit about yourself too?
Sure.
Okay.
I forgot to do that, right?
No, that's all right. No, that's...
Yes, I love having this conversation, Susan, because it's so important to understand, isn't it? I think, firstly, on your analogy about the dance, it's like we're doing the dance where we are just powerless in this, right? We're being dominated, and so really the first step is to be able to step onto the dance floor as equals, okay, with greater power to speak for ourselves. And when I talked about the problem with our advocacy and the way that we've been divided purposely by anyone with an interest in exploiting our land or to avoid accountability in the decision makers of this nation's case, then we are not one person stepping up together, and so that's the first issue here. The Uluru Statement merely seeks to have the opportunity for us really to come together, our people, or our diverse nations and cultures and perspectives, and then have that guarantee that consistently and regularly going forward to be able to reach consensus on our collective priorities. And so our priorities from nation to nation, you know, from different parts of the continent are always going to vary. But where we can agree this is a common issue, you know, whether it's, community services or native title and land rights, where we can agree on the way forward to that, then we can coherently go out and say to a government and to the nation, this is what we want. And that's so much more powerful than the way that we are doing things now, where it ends up being a debate over Twitter and Facebook amongst our own people, and this constant thing that we hear where, you know, so-and-so doesn't represent me and my mob, and so-and-so doesn't, and even within those nations that happens. And so this is a very, it's a great situation for those that want to keep us powerless. But the whole idea of the Uluru Statement proposal for a voice is to establish that structure in a way that cannot be easily removed like all the other times we've done it.
Or dismantled.
Yes, dismantled, repealed. I mean, the way that they got rid of the AAPA and those early representative bodies was by pure intimidation with the powers of the protection board, that they could steal the leaders' children, that they could direct us to work without pay and hold our wages and steal them. You know, all of those powers were used to destroy our voices of the past. And Howard destroyed ATSIC by firstly running a tactical, a strategy of demonising First Nations leaders, not dealing with the First Nations leaders that were problematic, which happens in any human organisation. Problem leaders need to be dealt with through the democracy, you know, the accountability that democracy gives, or the rules of the constitution of the organisation. Auntie Jackie Huggins, as you know, did a review into ATSIC, never saw the light of day. Howard had no interest in supporting ATSIC to evolve into an organisation that did more great things for our people. He only had an interest in destroying it. And so, you know, that's the real importance of constitutional enshrinement of a voice now.
Do you think?
I love what you said about tipping point. Sorry, I'll let you.
No, keep going. Sorry, I was interrupting.
I love what you said about a tipping point, in that the Reconciliation Week theme this year I thought was great, in that it was a real expression. I thought you could say it and express your frustration. You know, that for more than 20 years, good people that are on this forum today, you know, that are on this webinar, have done a lot of hard work, you know, marching across bridges, you know, reconciliation, morning teas, you know, all these things, truth-telling, you know, non-Indigenous people that have done some great truth-telling, learnt themselves and then spread this out, you know. And this work has really changed the sentiment of the nation, and I'm sure you can feel it too, Susan. The Australian people are ready for change. It's and it's, as you mentioned, the politicians are the ones that are, you know, behind us on this, that are not with us on this. They're still way back in the dinosaur ages, right? So this work that has been done, this sentiment that we have reached, where people are ready to do something, we are at that tipping point. The gatekeepers to the change that we desire, a permanent change to what constitutes us as Australians, to recognise our sovereign right, our United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples right to a political voice that we self-determine, is right there in our grasp. We've just got to convince the politicians now to open the door so that the question can be asked to the Australian people in a formal way, and we can use all of that more than 20 years of work at the ballot box to vote yes. In the meantime, all the truth-telling and reconciliation weeks are becoming a bit like the wheels are spinning on the road, but we're not moving anywhere, right? We're ready to let the rubber hit the road, but we need the legal and structural change, and we need that door open so that we can walk through it. So in this campaign, you know, we've built a great movement of people. More and more people are signing up, as you said, and our focus needs to be putting on pressure on politicians to open the constitutional door.
And I guess and I appreciate what you've just said, that we are waiting for politicians who are the power brokers within governments and successive governments that have played the tactical game of divide and conquer. And as you said, take one step forward and you know, sometimes 3-4 steps back. And, you know, people liken the experience of First Nations people on this continent to that of the Jewish people in the Holocaust and Germany. And I guess that if we run with that analogy and that similar life experience, it's a bit like the Jewish people who were survivors of those atrocities seeking permission from the Jewish government to move forward. So as our fellow brothers and sisters who call themselves Australians, because we are all Australians, at what point do we get our time in court in The Hague? So take it away from this continent and look at the historical context as to why we got to this point and what it is that we're advocating for as First Nations people, as sovereign people. Because do we believe that the government, who are the gatekeepers to us moving forward, who've had the strategy of divide and conquer, do we truly believe that they're going to go, oh yeah, let's just change the constitution, come on in, we're going to, you know, really make amends for the history of stealing your land and massacring your people and poisoning the water holes and rounding everybody up and putting them in missions, and oh, and we're just going to steal your babies. And so that constant putting in trauma, which is a form of control. And do we have faith as First Nations people, but also wider Australians, do we have faith that we should rely on government to take us to where we need to go? And even if we have a referendum around this, is that going to be enough? Is that going to take us far enough forward? Because to get to a place where we recognise two sovereignties coexisting, we've already been captured in the Australian realm. How do we step out of that identity and then also be the First Nations, Gurindji Woolwonga, Wiradjuri, Gumbaynggirr, you know, all of these different nations who we are and our identities? Do you think that there will come a day when that can happen?
Yeah, I think that's already here, the last part of what you were saying. We don't need permission from a government or recognition from anyone else, really, other than ourselves and our own communities and culture, that's who we are. So that's never been erased, not by the genocide or forced assimilation that you talked about. That survives with us, you know, it survives with our country, and it survives with our willingness to fight for our rights. The faith in the government is the precise reason why we need to build this, right? We cannot have faith in the powers that be that they'll do the right thing. And I'll dig deeper on this, actually. Just we're in a democracy where we're less than 3% of the population. I say less than 3% because a lot of our people are disenfranchised. So if we're around 3% of the population, I know from personal experience, I've run around the bush here and, you know, helping to enrol mob to vote, you know, in the remotest places of the territory towards elections. And that's hard work. We're actually filing today a discrimination case, hopefully you'll hear about it in the media soon, a discrimination case in the Human Rights Commission about the Australian Electoral Commission's discrimination against Aboriginal people in remote communities for enrolling them to vote, because they don't, they treat them differently. They expect a postal box, you know, a personal postal address, which doesn't exist. And that's not an impediment in other communities in the country for enrolling people to vote. So you've got, firstly, with 3% of, you know, the people of the population in a democracy where a lot of us are disenfranchised, struggle to make the ballot box because of, you know, the nature of the way the AEC does things in remote communities. We are powerless to hold decision makers to account. That is why, so I'm just sort of deconstructing why there is no faith in politicians, and the reason why is because they are not held to account by us in a democracy. There's no, you know, their greatest interest is being elected, right? And we have no pull over that. That's why a constitutionally enshrined voice, a right to political representation in the parliament or to the parliament is so important, because it amplifies our voice in a democracy where we're otherwise unheard. We have to do this. There is no separation. Like, for example, a small amount of people walked out of Uluru on a second of 3 days in protest and said, we're not agreeing to this. Their mind was made up before they got there, and they had the banners already rolled out before it even started. But this is normal politics, right? Factions, political ideals. But one of the things they say is that that if we are constitutionally recognised, then somehow that will suddenly assimilate us. You know, the day after a referendum will be assimilated. Lydia Thorpe herself has said that, a Green senator, one of the walkouts. And to me, it's the most ridiculous thing I can think of. You know, the more I think about it, the more ridiculous it is. You know, it's like as if more than 60,000 years of continuous culture can be undone by a white-fella law. You know, as if a referendum can suddenly say, oh, okay, well, there's no more Gurindji people anymore. We don't exist, we're assimilated now. It's just, you know, crazy. But I talk about this point because it goes to also, it's not a matter of having faith in politicians, in the government to do anything. It's the matter of being realistic about the power dynamic, that we are only 3% of the population, powerless democratically. As First Nations, we don't have an army or a navy or you know, so we cannot, and it's all a matter of power, right? So when the Uluru Statement says that this sovereignty coexists with the Crown, it's not saying that the Crown's sovereignty was achieved in a legitimate way. It's just saying this is the reality. Sovereignty means power and authority. The Crown has power and authority in this country. We've got to learn, as you were saying, and be able to do this dance where we can come out of the dance agreeing, okay, well, this is how we can live together now. Yeah. But until we address the power dynamic, we're not going to have that discussion in a proper way, right? Yeah. Because we're too divided. Yeah.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree that until we can heal the trauma in our communities and families and the different nations and become unified, have one voice, which has always been an aspiration, whether it was ATSIC or whether it was other bodies, to do the rights and social justice piece. There will always be the ability to divide and conquer, and then that message gets fractured. So then for non-Indigenous people, it becomes very confusing. And I know Claire just asked a question about, you know, what could non-Indigenous allies do in order to support this? It is really about being educated and truly understanding and knowing from where you live or where you work what First Nations people's wishes and desires about, you know, who they are, and that self-determination piece, because otherwise we're just all kind of, you know, doing our own dance, and we might all bump into each other and might look great, but do we get anywhere? Do we truly get that synchronized, you know, dance routine happening together? And I think that, in terms of how we do this, if non-Indigenous people get it and start advocating and then really pushing their local members, if that tipping point happens and we do get that wider support, because as you say, we're 3% of the population, like that has been the biggest issue for us since colonization really took hold on this land, and we need to have allies and have people who are out there speaking with powerful voices to really make sure that we can do this together, because ultimately people like you and I, Thomas, don't want our children and grandchildren to still be doing what we're doing right now, and still trying to educate non-Indigenous people to understand that our democracy, there is power in the people. And if we can bring people along on the journey that truly allows them to step into the power of the people, then we can shift this. So I guess the other question is, sorry, Joan, I'm just asking questions.
No worries. Keep going, Susan.
That do we need to worry about government? What if it was the power of the people?
We do, because that's where the power is centralized, really. I mean, who controls the army, the navy, the police forces that lock our people up and have us as the most incarcerated people on the planet? They do. You cannot ignore that power is there, right? You need to be able to reckon with it. So, I do hear this from some brothers and sisters, they're like, we don't need the government. We can establish our own voice. We can start our own political party even, which is a huge irony, right? Because anyway, yeah. But the point that I'm making is that there is no doing things outside of influencing the government in this present political situation, right?
Unless you went to the international courts.
No, because they represent colonizers, right? The international United Nations is full of colonized countries. They're more interested in wealth and trade and power than to worry about a small cohort of surviving First Nations people on a continent, in the Southern Hemisphere. So in reality, and I've heard this was actually said at Uluru by the walkout mob. They said, I've got this advice in my back pocket from this barrister, this brilliant barrister, who says that if we can raise $300,000, we can take our case to the international courts and the Constitution will be torn up. It's like, okay, if this barrister was so brilliant, he would have done that pro bono and be world famous right now. It's just not going to happen, right? And I think you mentioned it with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. These are not enforceable by the international community, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not going to work. And so there's some brilliant minds that have thought about this stuff. Not only the experts like Professor Megan Davis, Annie Pat Anderson, and others, but also activists, grassroots, the quieter advocates. We're all part of these dialogues and put our minds together to come up with the Uluru Statement. And really, ultimately, the voice is just the first step. I understand this as a unionist. The very first thing a collective of people need to do to be able to further themselves is to work out how they are represented. And to establish that structure of unity. And if the history of our struggle tells us that every time we've done that, a government has destroyed it, then how do we stop that from happening again? And in this country, in our political system, the only thing that does that, the only thing, is the Constitution, because it's the rule book that even the politicians must adhere to. Remember Section 44, dual citizenship, politicians lost their job. A First Nations voice that comes through a referendum is out of the reach of hostile governments, but it also comes with a mandate of the Australian people that we need to be heard and taken seriously. And that's a powerful first step. What comes after that could be many different things.
Okay, I mean, I think this webinar should go not finish at 12. We could keep talking and talking, but we've had a lot of questions for both of you around, you know, the influence of government, power, structures of government. We've also had some interesting comments about your dance analogy, Susan. So my view of that is we do not want to waltz through this whole situation. We need something like a jive or something faster. Anyway, I want to move the conversation now into just the issues to do with your elders. And, you know, we've only really touched on things like the effects of white settlement and colonisation on the removal of Indigenous kids. Just mentioned the incarceration rates, the unacceptably high levels of poor health. And we've talked about high mortality and First Nations people dying 20 years less than non-Indigenous people, and the overall inequality. Now, it's hard enough for our organisations, as small as we are, to put pressure on governments all the time around the issues to do with non-Indigenous older people. And we've seen the neglect of a lot of our older people in aged care facilities and the Royal Commission and all the recommendations that come from that. But I'd be really interested to hear from both of you just about how you perceive aging in First Nations. You know, what is the concept of an elder, and the 20 years plus that must have impacted on older people. We've talked about they don't live as long. That's a reality. But just a bit more about your notion of older people, or you call them elders, and is that appropriate? You know, just a little discussion around that. So start with you, Thomas, about how, just some background about the traditional way that older people are incorporated into First Nations communities.
Yeah, so, you know, from the moment we're born, we're taught the importance of our elders. In our culture, our elders are our, you know, mothers and fathers as well, our grandparents. In many of our cultures are the most important relationship. I know that's the case in the Uluru culture. I'm not sure about Gurindji, but I know that in many Aboriginal cultures, the grandparent and grandchild relationship is extremely important to the development of a child. For myself, you know, the way that I was taught about, you know, not just respecting elders, but the way that we look after them in, you know, when we go hunting or fishing, you know, we always go and visit, you know, the elders in the communities, places, and drop off some fish and turtle and things. Yeah, so it's still the way that we live today. I say in regards to elders, one of the, you know, the saddest things and the most motivating thing about being, you know, throwing everything at this campaign is not only, well firstly, it is that I've seen elders that were, you know, so important in the dialogues and at Uluru, and that, you know, I hugged and wiped tears from, you know, eyes, and that at Uluru when we endorsed the Uluru Statement with standing acclamation, and you know, such an emotional moment. I've seen them pass on without seeing, you know, the Uluru Statement come to reality, the establishment of this voice. And, you know, I mean, elders were basically talking about how in their lifetimes they wanted to build this platform as in this structure where our young people can step up to, rather than fighting for the platform in the first place like we are now. And this is a similar thing that was talked about in the dialogues before the Uluru Statement, about other petitions and statements that, you know, elders had been involved in their younger days. The, you know, Yirrkala Bark petitions through to the Barunga Statement. The Larrakia petition in 1972 here, people talked about that, and how many of those elders had passed on, you know, without achieving those things that they called for. So, yeah, it's something that we need to do before we lose more. You know, they want to see this reality come to reality.
And I think capturing the voice and honouring the voice and the life experience of our older people and elders isn't should be a priority, because as Thomas was saying, that they give so much input, knowledge and wisdom into business, whether it's the Uluru Statement or whether it's what's going on in their communities, and they have great hopes and aspirations for the younger generations to be able to live a good, happy, solid life, and they do pass whilst we're mucking about, and that breaks my heart. And I look at older people, elders, knowledge holders here in Sydney, and the way in which they're treated and disrespected, and that really concerns me, which is why I guess that I signed up and agreed to be a part of COTA New South Wales, and really hope to be doing some more good stuff that continues to advocate for the voices and needs of all older people. But our elders have survived so much trauma throughout the history, and they're really wanting to be a part of righting the wrongs, and as Thomas says, create those platforms that then the younger ones can come up and stand on and do the business into the future. So our parents are our first teachers, and so are our grandparents, and the imparting of deep cultural, spiritual, business and learnings came from those knowledge holders, and they invariably were grandparents. So we need to do better in how we respond to their needs, and what we do to support them, and how we do that, making sure that their needs are the center of the care that we wrap around them. Mm-hmm. And in a cultural context, you were taught to respect your elders and older people, and really sit and pay attention, and if they're speaking, don't talk, because if you're talking, then you're not listening, and you're missing the message. Mm-hmm. And I really love those old principles and the way that we were taught, and I am going to jump back to that analogy of dancing, because Josie's saying that even in jive that there's a leader and a follower. So look at it through our lens, look at it through our cultural context. There were dances that were done by women, there were dances that were done by men, and then there were dances that we did together. So each had their own set of reasons to dance. And I guess, the analogy is about the intent of what we're doing and how we do it and why we do it. And for me, working out the dance is really important, because we need to honor where those dances, for us culturally, we need to honor where those dances come from, and why we're doing it. And then how can we share knowledge about who we are as the original people of this land, the oldest living culture on the planet, and the way in which we live sustainably, because we taught the proper way. We were taught as children how to do this. And I'm advocating for this, being a child of the stolen generation. I was forcibly removed from my mother at birth, and I've had to go back and reconnect with her and my father. I've had to reclaim my identity, reclaim my culture, and reclaim what I see as so beautiful, particularly in my mother. And you would have seen her recently in the papers nationally about the 40-year wait, in terms of the apology, another apology, but also compensation for the people from Garden Point mission, which was the mission on Melville Island, and the people who have been waiting a long time to really get recognition for the breaches in human rights. So the other part of it is, just while we're talking about stolen gen, and here's the issue for me. When I was up in Darwin recently, I went looking for my birth certificate, because I wanted my original birth certificate. Births, deaths and marriages on the computer. Computer says no. I'm like, what? And this lovely lady, like she was so, I just don't know what to do. I need to speak to my supervisor, and I don't exist. I don't exist. And she didn't know what to do with that. And then we went to Darwin Hospital to look at the archival records for the record of birth. And there I was. So I was born, there is a record of that in the archives of the hospital, but I don't have a birth certificate that says who I truly am. So this is history that kind of continues to reverberate in who we are as First Nations people, as people who've been removed. And I, deeply honor and respect the work that my mother, Maxine Kundi, has done up in the Northern Territory to continue to stay in the game, to be able to get recognition, compensation, and an apology from the church and the Commonwealth for the abuses and the lack of duty of care. So she did it when I, in the article, and I knew this, that she did it because all of the old people kept dying. And she wanted to make sure that no other, family members, and I use that term in a much wider sense, in a cultural way, because these children were rounded up and put onto a mission. So they became family to each other. And family kept passing away. And that justice piece wasn't happening. And now it's happened 40 years later. So I just would like to, honor my mother, Maxine, and all of the people who have just stuck it out. And it's not pleasant talking about this stuff. And when you're asking, older people to have to justify what has happened and be able to talk about those experiences. So in some way they're recognized, and then step into, well, yes, that something was fundamentally wrong with removing children. The churches did what they did. There was a lack of duty of care, and now there's a recognition of compensation. So it's, that dance, dance is an interesting one.
It's a very interesting one, and I think we can keep moving it in all sorts of in different directions. But Susan, I just feel so sad about that story that you just shared. It's it really goes to the heart of us being human beings together. It's
yeah,
and good on your mother. Oh God, what courage! What
Yeah.
courage that shows.
Yeah.
I feel so honoured to actually have heard the Uluru Statement read by you, Thomas. And so I'd like to sort of move into, some of the principles, and for the last half an hour talk a lot about those principles, and then think about what action we can all do collectively, because there are lots of people in the chat area saying, what can we do? What can we do? So I want to actually give time for that at the end. But this whole issue of truth telling, I mean, seriously, it's such an important principle, and a little bit what you said, Susan, but we as non-Indigenous people, we have to listen to those stories, not interrupt with things like, oh, well, that happened to my mother and she's not Indigenous. It's about listening to your stories and the truth of them, and acknowledge them, and then do something with them. Change the way that you think, because truth will change the way that we think. We'll become more informed and more educated. So we've talked a bit, I think, about how some First Nations people didn't embrace the Uluru Statement originally, and there were issues for some people with the process. And Thomas, you talked about those people who walked out. So we get that sense that everyone's not going to believe in everything, and everyone's not going to agree with everything, but we do now have the Uluru Statement from the heart. And I'd like to talk a bit about the principles. So let's start with a difficult one. What about the Makarrata? A lot of people don't know a lot about that, Thomas, and I think that would probably be a really important discussion. And what would its role be, the Makarrata Commission?
Yes, Makarrata is a Yolngu word. It in the Uluru Statement is described as coming together after a struggle. It's a process. It's not a thing. It's another way to describe it is simply a dispute resolution process, right? And I think it should be acknowledged, firstly, that First Nations people, First Nations on this continent, the many cultures and societies were masters of dispute resolution. I think I mentioned this earlier, but you don't become the oldest living culture on the planet without great dispute resolution processes and understanding who belongs to what country and not trying to conquer each other. Experts agree with this idea that we were a very peaceful people based on languages, and how you have such different languages that are completely different to each other, hundreds of them on this continent. It demonstrates that we weren't a conquering people, that one language didn't come to dominate massive areas, right? So that's always important to establish first. So when we talk about Makarrata, we're not only talking about an ancient process of dispute resolution, but a current one that still survives today, and that exists, for the Gurindji people and other First Nations with different names for it. Okay. Makarrata, though, has been a word that's been part of the national discourse since the early 80s. As a word for not only coming together, but initially a way to talk about treaty making, when treaty was a bit of a dirty word across the full spectrum of politics, basically. So it's not something new. It's something that was gifted to our movement a long time ago, and again is gifted in the Uluru Statement as a process that we can undertake. The Makarrata Commission is about truth-telling, firstly, because, in the Makarrata process, it's about bringing the truth in your heart, to the discussion about, and then the second part of the Makarrata Commission is to supervise a process of agreement making. So the other part of Makarrata, in the traditional way, is that, you have good faith, is the way we describe it in bargaining and negotiations today, with good faith that you are going to reach an agreement and that you are serious about settling the past. The other thing about Makarrata is that it is, and this is described in the Uluru Statement, in that in Makarrata you end up with a stronger relationship than you did before the dispute. So, for example, a person that has done wrong in agreeing to what the settlement is, then becomes accepted in the family that were aggrieved as a member of the family, so loved. And so this aspiration that we have in the Uluru Statement is that we will firstly have a voice so that we are able to speak the truth and represent our truth and to reach a settlement, and then have a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood, is what the Uluru Statement says. Really come together and have that healed. I'll just finish by saying, in regards to truth telling, it's very, very important, as you said, Joan, but it is something that has already been done for a very long time. And as I mentioned, there's been some great work by both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, and it has helped us reach this tipping point now. The truth, though, on its own is like the rubber's, spinning and the rubber not hitting the road, in that the truth is something that must be leveraged to get the settlement now, right? The truth is known by a majority of Australian people already. So there's nothing, while there's a lot more to learn and to tell and to discover, the truth is known by a majority of Australian people. We know that because the polling consistently since 2017, not only, by our own research, Crosby and Textor have done polling, but also, Reconciliation Australia's surveys and polling, shows that a majority of the Australian people know the truth and they want reconciliation. They want a change. They're ready for this change. That tells us they know the truth. And secondly, the decision makers in this country that make the harmful decisions, they know the truth too. Because there's truth telling not only in history books and lectures and movies and documentaries more and more nowadays, and in forums like this, but the truth is in the Royal Commission reports, chock-a-block full of the truth about deaths in custody, about stolen generations, about youth in detention. The politicians know all of these truths, right? They've got it right there. And let's talk about this example of them knowing the truth. The Closing the Gap report has been going on in Parliament annually for more than a decade. Every time talking about failure, but every time full of truth-telling, right? This is the truth. The Prime Minister for both sides of politics have talked about the truth. So my point is that the voice is extremely important. It's a priority because we need the political power to use the truth now to reach a settlement. And that's the first step in Makarrata. That's why we always talk about voice more than truth-telling and agreement making. Sorry, just lastly, on agreement making, you've got to establish a representative body before you get a decent agreement. I understand that as a unionist. You don't have, great conditions as a wharfie before you start a union. We had to establish our union and then win our conditions.
Yeah. I'm going to come to Susan about the big concept of sovereignty, because that's another one of the principles in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But just one thing you mentioned then, Thomas, about the voice, the voice to Parliament. And we know that some MPs who aren't into the truth have misclassified the whole thing as an Indigenous chamber in Parliament. And what sort of nonsense is that? We know that's nonsense. But you describe the voice to Parliament as really important. Just a little bit more about that for the people that are on the webinar would be useful, I think.
Me, so it goes to what I was, I'm most passionate about this because I know that every issue we have as First Nations people, whether it's crowded housing, not enough money going into communities and services, whether it's about the justice system, incarceration rates, anything you can think of, right, that is an issue for our people, all goes to the decisions made in the federal parliament, because that's where the power resides, or even state legislation must be consistent with federal legislation. And so the voice is really about influencing decisions that are made there, but also having the ability to campaign for things that we agree are most important. And we can't even do that part yet, agree on what's most important really amongst our people in a proper way. That's the most succinct way I can describe the importance of a voice, is just creating that ability to do so much else, yeah.
I was just about to sneeze then, but I think I've held it back. Susan, the whole concept of sovereignty, that seems, it just I can't get my head around it enough, but can you just give us a little bit of an insight into why you see that as really important? You've talked about it already, but
yeah. So and Thomas has alluded to it as well, that there are different nations, First Nations people, and then nations be almost stepping out of the Australian realm and becoming sovereign nations. And I find that interesting, and I find that I guess challenging in terms of how we do the dance, how we live together as peoples, all peoples on this landscape. And I guess that truth-telling element is what informs and what keeps this whole business going. And there is I think a point where we become so saturated by us actually telling our truth, and then what happens with that story and that voice, and what do other people do with that? So how do we inform and tell our stories? Because the power is in the story, and the power is in when people understand our version of the truth from our perspective. Because I can tell a story and different people will get different things out of that story. And that's just them hearing, to a certain extent, a truth through their lens and filter. So our stories of truth, of our life experience, of all the different nations that we are as First Nations people, becomes incredibly overwhelming, and becomes almost to a point of that saturation where non-Indigenous people don't know what to do with that and how to move forward. And so I think that, you know, there is a need to protect our older people in and around the re-traumatization of telling the truth in their stories. And we need to do that piece better. And I think that there is a role in there for COTA and COTA New South Wales. In terms of sovereignty, that's just a whole different kind of kettle of fish, which confuses people. And I think it's also, so if you only understand your world within the Australian realm, when we start to talk about the sovereignty of individual nations on this continent that we today know as Australia, it gets really confusing. And there are people who are stepping out and doing that. So I think that notion that's spoken about and written about in the Uluru Statement is very powerful, that sovereignties can coexist. I think the history of messaging from the government has been to put fear in non-Indigenous people. So you had the Mabo case, you had land rights, you had the 10-point plan, you had, back then the then Prime Minister, putting the fear into the general public of, black people are just going to come and take your backyard. And so I think the way in which people need to see and cut through to a truth. Why is government doing what they're doing? Why are First Nations people saying and advocating for what they are? What is the deep message in the Uluru Statement? How can sovereignties coexist? How can we tell the truth that doesn't continue to re-traumatize ourselves? How can we have the Makarrata Commission that creates the platform, the structure that allows us to move forward? And I like what Thomas was saying in and around, how unions exist and why they exist and how do they get formed. People are doing things, they come together, whatever sector that the union is covering. And then there is a need to put some framework and ground rules around, what's going on. And I think that, we're at that point here now, even though that we've, from an international level, you've had the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, you've had this whole, the sovereignty movement, the treaty movement, the reconciliation movement. And it's slowly educating non-Indigenous Australians about a history and a truth on this land. But to take it back even further, so if we only know the history as written by the point of view of the conqueror, and we digest our content through history books or certain movies, it formulates our beliefs. And so when people's beliefs are challenged, you need to be able to come forth with a level of safety of doing that, to be able to share a different narrative. So the narrative of sovereignty of First Nations people can be quite challenging for non-Indigenous people. And I guess the whole point of how it was written in the Uluru Statement is to hopefully break down that fear that might creep into people's consciousness, or the way in which people might reject the Uluru Statement, that there are ways in which we can continue to have these conversations to get us all across the line. For me, first and foremost, it is about First Nations people's sovereignty and rights on this country. I have been impacted, and you call it the stolen generations because there were different generations. In my female family line, it was 3 generations of women that were impacted by that policy. So it's really about being able to unpack stuff, to almost reorder it in a way that people kind of understand it, and then be able to do something with that information, and to activate how we're going to move forward to right the wrongs of the past, because we keep being challenged by as governments who are the power brokers, who are the, I want to say the fat controllers from Thomas the Tank Engine, like they are there absolutely directing and guiding the trains. So do we build our own set of tracks that takes the trains off in a different direction? How do we do this? How do we really make sure that we and the elders have their rightful place within community, and that they can live their life, which is what my mother was advocating for. All of those old people who've been impacted by history to be able to live with some sense of peace.
Absolutely, some sense of peace, which leads us in, we've got about 10 minutes, and of course everyone's coming in chatting, what can we do, what can we do? So let's think about moving to action. So what can we do? Thomas, from your point of view, how can people get involved, and what should we be doing? And then I'll come to you, Susan.
I'll start with the simplest action. If you haven't already, it's important that you register your support on the website, ulurustatement.org is one of the websites. There's also fromtheheart.com.au, and on that website you can add your photo, as a signatory of the statement, basically, even though it's not the actual statement, it's, I support the Uluru Statement. So there's those 2 websites, and by signing up on those, you can you will receive the regular updates about any particular actions that are important at the time. For example, recently we had the voices being co-designed and in a government process, and so we've been activating people to influence that process to make sure that it's a constitutionally enshrined voice and that the referendum is a priority. So we mobilised over 5,000 submissions into that, and thanks to some of the people on here that were involved in that. So actions like that come up from time to time where we need to influence something, and that's what we do. Secondly, simply sharing the Uluru Statement is a really powerful action, and I'll explain why. That is because in our polling throughout the years, we have seen a correlation between those that say they will vote yes in a referendum. That number has risen from around 50% to 70% today. And it's important to note there that this has been without a slick, well-resourced campaign. That's just grassroots struggle. The union supported me to do my bit. Auntie Pat Anderson with Lowitch, Professor Megan Davis, and other activists and people that were at Uluru, and Susan and others. All that work, has just been organic and without any government funding or anything. And so that number has grown 20% at the same time as the number of people that have said that they have read the Uluru Statement and have learnt about it. So, this correlation tells us that when people learn about the Uluru Statement, that motivates them. It's a very motivational statement, and sensible and achievable, yet powerful. So that is an important action. Think about the book clubs you're involved in, or, sporting groups, or just in your own family. Have a think yourself about how you can spread the Uluru Statement and give people an explanation on what it's about. That's a powerful thing. Next, I'll talk about the politicians. In this campaign, the politicians are the decision makers, right? So always in campaigning, you're thinking, firstly, what is the world as it is? So you have to be realistic about the world if you're going to have a successful campaign. In our system, in our in our legal system, the only way you get to referendum is for the Parliament to pass a referendum bill and take us to a referendum. So they are the decision makers that are influenced by the people. So always spreading the word is an important thing to do to motivate them. That's one of the things that we do. But just writing to them, and I saw someone say they're going to write to their federal member, that is an important thing to do. It might feel like they're not going to listen to you, but please do it because of weight of numbers. Even better than that, organise a delegation. So perhaps, you know, a whole lot of your friends or fellow members of this organisation write to the local federal member and say, we want to come and visit you. We want to talk about the Uluru Statement. Take a delegation, look eye to eye and say, you know, if you support it, keep supporting it. If you don't, you need to pull your head in, or we're going to campaign in this electorate to see that you don't get votes. You know, so any sort of actions like that are really important. Thanks. And my books are pretty handy for educating people as well.
I was waiting for a bit of that. And then, of course, there's also there are always lots of exhibitions on. I mean, there's a few good things on in Sydney. Now he's going
to get it.
No, I'm going to get someone else's book.
Oh.
Professor Megan Davis has just released this one as well. She's a brilliant academic, but it's in quite simple terms. You know, anyone can understand it, so it's a good educational tool as well.
Yeah, and there are exhibitions on. There's a few good ones on in Sydney at the moment. There's a fantastic one on in Canberra that I saw just recently about the Indigenous version about Cook's stuff, and it was really enlightening. And I've been traveling a lot in Tasmania, and you know, just everywhere we went, not everywhere, but now there is an acknowledgement of First Nations people as you go into a place, and tread lightly. You know, this is their country.
Yeah, people are ready, right?
We are. We're all ready.
Yeah.
I was sending all
referendum so we can change the nation.
I was sending all this back to my relatives, saying, "Look at this. When you know, how does this? This is amazing." So there's so many things that are now, as you say, very eloquently, Thomas, that we're all ready. Susan, from your point of view, what would you suggest?
Oh, look, I'll be short and sweet. I think fundamentally it comes down to the relationships that we have with each other. And, you know, if someone in your family was in pain and being harmed, people do everything in their power to do something to support, help and heal. So, you know, people ask us all the time, you know, oh, what is it that we can do as non-Indigenous people? Have the relationship with us, actually get to know who we are, understand the narrative, understand, you know, that whilst that there are traumas in our history, there is also really beautiful things about who we are, our identity and culture that we want to share. And by sharing some of those principles that come from, you know, 65,000 year plus of cultural practice, is kind of worth something of value. And we, our elders, have always wanted to share that so we can coexist on this landscape together in a better way that's more sustainable. So yes, people, organisations, schools, and government departments are doing reconciliation action plans. I think we need to take it the next step and raise it up to really just getting down to that fundamental relationship with a community that lives within your reach, families who are at the local schools, actually find out what's going on. And I think as we're coming out of, you know, this pandemic and lockdowns, that there is a real sense of compassion, of caring for each other. And there has been a fear in the past about, you know, connecting, reaching out, having relationships with us as the First Nations people. We are just people. We live on this continent, and when we can actually see the truth in that, then hopefully we'll do something different. And our kids do it. They just play with each other. They don't see colour. There is such a genuine compassion that children have that shines through until we knock that out of them as they get older. So that for me is, you know, in the very least, just get to know who we are.
Wonderful. It's just wonderful. Thank you so much. It's just been, I think it's been one of my favourite webinars, and I have been honoured to be able to facilitate it. And both of you are such amazing people and wonderful educators. I mean, you are terrific educators. The way that you talk to us about serious issues in such a short period of time. I know that everyone online has been educated and informed today, and that's what we wanted, and that's what's got to keep going. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I'm going to think about this dancing stuff. I think Susan and I, we could talk about this at at another time. So thank you everyone out there for joining us. Just a reminder that we run webinars regularly. We've got another one next Thursday, which is about the release of the State of the Older Nation report. We did this a few years ago, and there's another one to be launched next week. So that's really important. I thank you again, both Susan and Thomas, from all of the people that are online, and thank you for educating us. So that's it, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
See you, Thomas.
Yellow.
Talk
Bye,
soon.
Thomas. Bye,
See you,
Susan.
Susan. See you, John.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.